First of all, Hanny, congratulations.
Going on mute so you don't hear me typing. Sorry about that.
Yeah, we still have 2 or 3 minutes. So
yeah. Hi, everyone who's joining us.
yeah, I think Stephanie, you can cut out the first 2 minutes right from the recording.
I'll be back in a second.
Or you can maybe you can restart right in 2 or 3 minutes.
Nobody said anything terribly incriminating. So
Not yet, but wait, I haven't heard yet.
I edit out all of this. I've just learned I try and catch it at the beginning and it seems rushed. So I'm like, I'll just start recording from the moment we let people in.
Yeah.
And then add work to my own to edit it all out.
It's good to see everybody.
Hi there.
Hi, Chris.
Oh wow, we have the wonderful. Yeah.
How's my hair?
Oh, great. You're
Not
not
as
in
good as mine
Istanbul
though,
today.
but yeah.
You're not in Turkey, Chris.
Not today. I'm worldly. I'm more see
Yeah, and
branching out.
Elizabeth, Chris, and Ken, thanks again for yesterday. That was great that you could come in.
Thank you. Hope it all went well.
Yeah, it was great. Oh, hi Rob. Good to
Hi,
see you.
everyone.
It's
How
been
are
a
you?
while.
It
How are you
is.
doing?
I'm surviving.
All right. I think that's what we all share these days.
Yep.
Oliver's still here, so yesterday had to have gone well.
Well, I don't think the outcome's in yet.
No, I think we have to wait a couple of weeks.
Aha.
So, Stephanie, do you want to restart the recording?
I never stopped it.
Are you sure you want to have the chatter in there as well?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll delete. I'll just upload it with no editing. See what happens.
Okay. So now it's time to get serious. All right. So, welcome everybody to this morning session. My name is Oliver Schmidtke. I'm Director of the Center for Global Studies, and I have the great pleasure of welcoming you to Hanny Hilmy's book presentation on decolonization, sovereignty, and peacekeeping. It's always thrilling to come to this point after years of work, first finishing your PhD and then turning it into a book. And these achievements, I think, book launches in this respect are really, the point in which we come together and celebrate a major piece of achievement, scholarly, work. So it's a great pleasure doing this. Before I get to introduce Hanny, who will describe a bit his book and what he has done and how he got to his research, let me remind you of a couple of peacekeeping, housekeeping things. But before we do this, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees and Squamish and the Sanish peoples whose historical relationship with the land continue to today. Although we are in a virtual world, I think it's all the more important to think about land community in spite of us being able now to meet in this format, and the responsibility that comes from where we work, where we live here on the West Coast of Canada. Very briefly, I think you're all pros at this by now. Please keep your microphones off and the cameras turned off while we are presenting, and then you're invited to use the chat function to come up with comments and questions. But ideally, please, start your camera there so we see you. The lost sense of community, maybe we can compensate for it a little bit by seeing your lovely faces and bringing you in this way. Also, as you just noted, this session is being recorded, and we're going to make this recording available. And Stephanie, if you could go back, I think you all know now where to find these functions. Here you see the chat function and contribute to this. So you can raise your hand, but I think normally we are small enough a group that we can manage the discussion and Q&A session a bit later on. Thank you. Now let me introduce Hanny, who has been with the center as a fellow for a long time now, an associate fellow and the coordinator of the Middle East discussion group at the center. And Hanny, as you will hear in a second, has a very distinguished background coming from Egypt to us, where he has worked for both the Egyptian government and the League of Arab States. And you will realize in a second how this professional experience, his personal background, has greatly informed his take on this part of history in the Middle East. Hanny has completed his PhD at UVic. It was a multidisciplinary endeavor, also, I think, contributing to the richness and wealth of the knowledge that Hanny brought to us, and which is encapsulated in this book. He also, before coming to UVic to complete his PhD, he received degrees in Cairo from the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Ottawa. Hanny, as you can see here, is also an active participant in the work of the International Peace Academy, and he has had visiting research fellowships at the International Peace Research Institute in Oslo. And you can see here in his spare time, you know, the traveling and hiking. What I didn't know about Hanny is his passion for mystery TV shows. I'm not sure how this influences your scholarly research, but, you know, maybe we hear a little bit about this on a different occasion. But it's such a pleasure, Hanny, to have you here and speak to this huge accomplishment of yours, and something I know you're very passionate about, that you've shared with us on various occasions. But it's wonderful that we can bring you in, have you speak to your book, and then we have the all-star cast to respond to this, and I will introduce our panelists in a second. First, I would like to turn it over to you, Hanny, to introduce us to your book, a couple of reflections, and then we come, I'm not sure how long you will speak, for half an hour or so, roughly, or 40 minutes, and then we come to our respondents. So, Hanny, it's over to you.
Thank you, Oliver, for your introduction. It's very nice, and also for moderating this session. The Center for Global Studies is, I think, the ideal place to launch this book. The great staff and the amazing fellows made the task truly rewarding. I was asked to talk about the motivation, first of all, of writing the book. Well, it stems from my own personal life experience and academic interest. In fact, this book should have been written a long time ago. Who's this guy there on the screen? Okay. At the University of Pennsylvania, and as well as at Carleton University in Ottawa, I was asked to write about that very subject. I resisted that because I thought that I would be biased, because I was part of that experience. So I thought that I'm not going to be objective. However, at UVic, I suddenly, or not suddenly, after several long reflection, decided that this is the way to go. And I started writing for my dissertation, which eventually turned into a book. My involvement with the subject matter of the book began many years ago as a child growing up in Egypt during the heyday of national liberation and struggle to end the empire, which was controlling Egypt and the rest of the Middle East at the time. My father was an Egyptian army officer. He was transferred to Ismailia in the Suez Canal region to work for military intelligence. He was involved in anti-British activities. Don't tell anybody. British agents tried to assassinate him while I was with him in his car. Luckily, the bullets missed their mark. So to be exposed at that young age to the rough and tumble of Anglo-Egyptian confrontation had definitely left its influence on my life. So this is slide 1. Can we have now slide 2, please? Yeah, this is my father when he was transferred to Ismailia. He was a major. And that's how I was. He always took me with him whenever he went to travel somewhere, which will happen again when after the United Nations forces arrived. But anyway, Egypt has obtained its nominal independence in 1922. Britain refused to vacate or leave the country altogether, insisting on keeping control over the Suez Canal military base. So there was a lot of resistance, a lot of agitation. And if we turn to slide 3, please. This is when the British forces surrounded the Egyptian police headquarters in Ismailia and ordered them to surrender. When they refused, they were completely annihilated. So they were shot, they were killed, tanks and all that. So that really increased one of the reasons which hastened the arrival of the 1952 army takeover. The next day was called the Black Saturday because Cairo was on fire. People, mobs and all that went and attacked all foreign establishments, and so that paved the way for the Egyptian army to take over in July 1952. Now, with the army takeover, President Nasser embarked on massive socio-economic development program, land reforms, industrialization, education, healthcare, and women's rights. That's what was in the 1956 Constitution. And they were at the top of his agenda. His anti-colonial stand earned him mass support and loyalty throughout the Arab world and beyond. I want to emphasize here that I am not performing a propaganda service for Nasser or his legacy. My involvement with the government ended a long time ago, but compared to the leaders who followed him, he was incredibly incorruptible and utterly dedicated to his ambitious development program. Sadat, Mubarak, and even Sisi have blurred the line between public and private funds. During the uprising against Mubarak in 2011 and Muslim Brothers in 2013, photos of Nasser were displayed by many protesters across Egypt. Sadly, the so-called Arab Spring has turned into an Arab nightmare. Slide 4, please. That shows Nasser distributing land reform documents for the landless peasants. There were millions of landless peasants in Egypt who were benefited from this program. Each family received 5 hectares of land, and it was all joined together into a cooperative to ensure, economic efficiency. His massive reformist agenda transformed the lives of millions. It also alarmed the surrounding totalitarian, and corrupt Arab regimes who feared losing their privileges. Moreover, Nasser refused to join any Western alliance against the Soviet Union. He informed the Western emissaries, trying to convince him that his main concern was the growing Israeli threat, not an ideological fight with the Soviets. In retaliation for his lack of cooperation, the US and Britain withdrew their guarantees for a World Bank loan to Egypt to finance the giant high dam project, which was part of his ambitious development drive. In response, President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company in order to use the canal revenue, which was substantial, for the development purposes. Now, just a word about the nationalization of the company. Many people refer to his action as the nationalization of the Suez Canal. Obviously, this is nonsense because the Suez Canal is part of Egypt. You don't nationalize part of your country. It was the company which was operating the canal traffic which was nationalized. I remember listening to Nasser's speech on the radio, no television then, while my father was out participating in the takeover of the assets of the Suez Canal Company. Slide 5, please. That's Nasser announcing the nationalization on the 26th of July, 1956. The British, after having concluded the agreement with Egypt to evacuate the British base in the Suez Canal region, that was in 1954. They completed the withdrawal in June 56, and they returned in October 56 to resume their occupation of the Suez Canal region. But that's we are jumping ahead of ourselves here. The imperial order could not tolerate the challenge to their fading dominance. Britain, France, and Israel conspired to launch the Suez War in order to scuttle Nasser's threat to their positions. Slide 6, please. This is the plan which the three countries came to finalize in the town of Sèvres, outside. It's a small little village outside Paris, and in total secrecy. The plan was for Israel to attack Egypt into the Sinai, trying to approach the Suez Canal as fast as they could, and then the British and the French would issue an ultimatum to both countries to withdraw their troops 10,000 east and west of the canal. And the glitch was that the Israeli forces did not reach the canal at the time. They were still stuck in the Metla Pass, which is on the letter T on the map there. So Egypt was asked to withdraw inside its own territory, away from the canal, and Israel was asked to withdraw 10 miles to the canal. And also the ultimatum was for Egypt to surrender the entire Suez Canal region from Port Said to Suez and the Suez Canal itself. Of course, Egypt rejected the ultimatum, and the collusion with Israel was very exposed. Slide 7, please. This is the assault on Port Said, the land assault after they landed from the Mediterranean. And then 8, please. This is the bombing of Port Said, which was substantial. Now, what was the Egyptian response? The Egyptian response, which was Operation Cork, which was planned, devised, and implemented by my father. And he decided to block the canal, and he had very heated discussion with Nasser, who called him, and he said, I have to block the canal now. The British have already landed in Port Said, and they're moving south, and we are going to lose the canal. So Nasser told him, but I have to be content. I have to contend with the international reaction. I mean, the canal, we took over the canal and we promised to keep it open. He said, so my father said, you know, it's going to be a moot point, because once they take over, it doesn't matter whether we promise or not promise to keep it open. So finally they agreed, and my father, slide 9, please, commandeered all the ships he could handle, blew them up, put cement and dynamites and blew them up. So that's the entrance to the canal from the Mediterranean. And number 10, please. This is the entrance to Port Said Harbor, which is, it's a sad thing, but it had to be done, I suppose. Number 11. This is the bridge of Ferdan Bridge, which connects Sinai to the rest of Egypt, which was blown up. And number 12. This is part of the damage inflicted on Port Said by the invading forces. Now, number 13. This after the war was condemned by the United Nations, and the General Assembly voted for the creation of the United Nations Emergency Force, known as UNEF. There were a lot of problems about who is in control of the presence of those forces on Egyptian soil. And Egypt did not budge. They wanted to have control. So Hammarskjöld, Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General of the United Nations, flew to Cairo in November and had a discussion and negotiations, which was difficult, because Nasser wanted to have Egyptian sovereign right to consent to the presence of the international force, unimpeded and unquestioned, while Hammarskjöld wanted to keep the decision in UN hands. After difficult negotiation, which were about to collapse, the two sides arrived at what became known as the Good Faith Agreement, whereby the UN promised to keep the UN troops only in place with the consent of Egypt. Similarly, Egypt promised not to ask for the removal of the troops before their mission was completed. The UN approved the agreement, and it became the official basis for the UNEF operation in Egypt. Number 14, please. After the approval of the United Nations agreement with Egypt, the UNEF forces started to arrive in the place called Abu Suer, which is a military air base, which was heavily bombed. My father, after the ceasefire, said, "Would you like to come and see what's happening?" So I said, "Sure." And I went with him, and this is in his office, temporary office in Abu Suer. Number 15. These are the three generals connected with the United Nations forces. On the right is General Burns, Canadian, the first commander of the force. On the left is General Ricky, the last commander of the forces from India. And in the middle is my father, who was the chief liaison officer with the United Nations. The UN generals and their Egyptian counterpart worked very hard to establish a cooperative approach in the midst of a charged and unsettled political and legal situation. The UNF was very successful peacekeeping operation for almost 11 years. The mission helped keeping the fighting at bay, but it did not result in a comprehensive conflict resolution. This is why another deadly war followed in 1967. Oh, number 16, please. Stephanie? Oh, sorry, yeah, okay. This is the picture I took of General Burns when he was attending a military parade in Deir el-Balah, which is the Gaza Strip. That was my first camera. I received it as a gift for my birthday. So I took a photo and I sent a copy to him. Anyway, number 17, please. And this is with General Ricky, the last commander in Europe. Now, because I had to personalize this presentation, I have to talk about my experience during the war. So I lived through 2 wars of colonial aggression, the 67 war, Suez War, and the 56 Suez War, and the 67 Arab-Israeli conflict. In 1956, the dreaded wail of air raid sirens, the terrifying sound of anti-aircraft guns, the exploding bombs on the ground, the search lights piercing the night skies in search of enemy planes, the phosphorus lights dropped by parachutes to eliminate the intended targets below, and the car headlines and windows painted in blue and covered by tapes are all part of my memory. After the ceasefire in 56, I accompanied my father, as I said, to Abu Suer, and the United Nations troops started to arrive in force. I decided, while he was busy in meetings, to go and survey the area around. So I went to some of the destroyed hangars, which bombed heavily, metal structures, in search of war souvenirs, collecting in the process some unexploded munitions, which was a dangerous and foolish thing to do. Less dangerous and more enjoyable was the generous gift of chocolate provided by the Swiss Air crews bringing the UNF troops to Egypt. Number 18, please. This is President Nasser and General Hilmy, my father, having some meeting with some UNF officers. A few months later, we moved to Gaza in Palestine, and the story of UNEF began to take hold. Now, after this war, I went to university and graduated. I started work for the government. As a junior government civil servant in 1967, I participated with others in providing shelter in schools, dorms, hotels, warehouses, storage facilities, tents, private homes, relatives, etc., for about 3 million Egyptians forced to leave their homes in the Suez Canal region, especially the cities of Ismailia and Suez, in the face of Israeli massive bombardments. Hundreds were killed, thousands were wounded, and homes and the infrastructure were all but decimated. Bodies were transported in trucks for mass burial. Many were walking in the streets, dazed and shocked, looking for their loved ones. Sadly, the government imposed information blackout on the extent of the disaster inflicted on the region for fear of showing weakness and lack of resolve. Number 19, please. This is me during that time in 1967. Now, many books were written about the Middle East, the ongoing confrontation in a volatile region, and the role of UNEF. By doing this, I wanted to add a human voice to the story and relate my personal reflection and experience. The essence of the book is, okay, let me go to number 20, please. This is Professor Johan Galton, the pioneer of peace research, and number 21. And this is me with him when we went to ski north of Oslo, and I was there a visiting research fellow at the International Peace Research Institute. And my claim to fame is that I stayed most of the time on the ground instead of, standing trying to ski. I had no idea why people do that, but it's enjoyable, I understand. The book has three major components: decolonization. How are we doing for time? Stephanie? Okay.
How much longer do you need, Hanny? What do you think would be good?
I don't know. What's
Take another 15 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks.
Okay.
The decolonization process resulted in hastening the end of empire in the 1950s and 1960s. The French general André Boffre, one of the leaders of the attack on Egypt in 1956, said that the Anglo-French expedition against Egypt proved to be the turning point of the post-war period. This was the end of empire, the end of an epoch. Boffre added that Israel was the catalyst used to launch the attack. The process of decolonization was the result of two aspects of foreign domination: colonialism, which was the conquest and settlement of foreign land and resources. You can consult Lumba and Osterhammel and Holland. Holland rejected any justification of any moral justification for the process, and he said that it's only a mask to appropriate resources of the third world. Second, imperialism, which is a global strategic competition as well as the product of surplus capital looking for profits abroad. Hobson rejected the claim of upholding the universal superiority of Western culture. He said it was nothing more than a public guarantor of private financial investment abroad, exposing it as a grotesque monster of hypocrisy. The imperial structure relied on a network of collaborating colonial national elites who were benefiting from the external control which allowed them to continue their exploitation of their subjects. According to Robert Young, the West mistook technological advance as a cultural superiority. On the other hand, Nehru, India's first post-independence prime minister, offered his shock value of imperialism as a significant tool to shake the colonized societies away from their centuries-old complacency and traditionalism. Edward Saeed, on the other hand, rejected that. He said colonial leaders were mistaken in believing that cooperation with the imperial authority, despite the underlying adversarial relationship, was the only way to move forward. When the colonial imperial enterprise ceased to have any strategic or economic significance, this engagement, voluntary or otherwise, was inevitable, according to Holland. The imperial powers lost the self-sustaining virtue of colonial equilibrium. Due to the restive colonized elites, the collaborative decomposition set in. I don't know what happened to my tongue today. And the dysfunctional colonial project led to the project of disimperialism. Number 22, please. This is a Russian cartoon depicting the fate of the British and the French empires on the banks of the Suez Canal. Many of the newly independent colonies, however, continued some aspects of collaboration with former colonial powers, politically and commercially. In fact, in many cases, the oppressive European elites were replaced by equally oppressive national elites. Chatterjee, Douara, and Mamdani claimed that the new elites were prisoners of the European intellectual roots, and they were betraying their education or their assumption of these intellectual roots when they started to govern their own countries. Now, the other thing which is prominent in this book is sovereignty, which is a political legal concept started to take shape in the Middle Ages with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which combined the treaties of Osnabrück in May and Münster in October. I hope the pronunciation is correct, Oliver. Sovereignty emerged as emerged at the end of the incessant European civil and religious wars and the removal of the church as an extraterritorial authority. The rulers' unbounded authority began to recede, and new bases for governance and authority, grounded in the developing concept of nationalism, began to develop. Political sovereignty is mirrored by territorial sovereignty. The unique sovereign territorial entities are mutually recognized internationally. The resulting sovereign borders were inviolable. In general, sovereignty is absolute, perpetual, and it accords legitimate right to govern with exclusive supreme authority within a defined territory, regardless of the type of governance, whether it's democratic or non-democratic. That does not affect the right of sovereign power to exercise its authority within its borders. And sovereignty, on the other, moreover, is the constituent idea of the global system of state authority. The system, however, is facing many challenges and contradictions because of the changing global conditions. What is described as the gradual circumspection of the sovereign state. There are increasing limits on the exercise of sovereign authority. The protection of human rights is challenging the sacrosanct notion of the supreme sovereign state. Also, the modern system of sovereignty assumed the equality between sovereign states and mandates the non-intervention in the internal affairs of other sovereign states. Egypt's struggle for the assertion of sovereignty during the whole UNEF experience, at the beginning and at the end as well, was a testament to the contradiction between egalitarian international law and the unequal distribution of power in the international system. This quandary will continue to undermine the system of states globally. Sovereign consent, which is part and parcel of the notion of sovereignty, which figured prominently during the UNEF mandate, is another aspect of the sovereignty of state which encountered repeated tests and contradictory interpretation. Peacekeeping operations and the protection of human rights figured prominently in the application of sovereign consent. The Vienna Convention on Treaties of 1969, Article 56, agreed that the nations must not resort to unilateral denunciation of agreement. So the agreement between UNEF and Egypt was portrayed as Egypt consent to have the United Nations forces on its soil, period. There was no mention of the agreement, the good faith agreement, which said that any stationing of UNEF forces on Egyptian soil has to be with the consent of Egypt. Anyway, this prohibition of unilateral denunciation of agreement had two exceptions. Number one, if the contracting parties intended to allow it, or if such intention is implied in the treaty. Both intention and implication figured prominently during the establishment and termination of UNEF. UNEF was the first international regime designed to separate combatants and ensure the return of the status quo. There are several peacekeeping experience before, even under the League of Nations, but they were not designed to separate combatants. The peacekeeping operation in Kashmir after the war between India and Pakistan also was just observers. They were not deployed there to ensure that the two parties are not engaged in fighting. And sent to Palestine after the first Arab-Israeli war was also observers. They did not have any so-called peacekeeping function. Number 24, please. This is a picture depicting the United Nations deployment in Sinai, the UNF troops. So because the United Nations troops were sent to separate combatants, but it was not allowed to use military force. It was the operation was described as passive peacekeeping. So the guidelines governing the UNF deployment rested on three fundamental principles, or the peacekeeping triangle must have the sovereign consent of the host government. That's number one. Number two, impartiality. The international force is not going there to affect certain political or military objective. And number three, the non-use of force. The international troops except for legitimate self-defense. Number 25, please. Canada invited General Hilmy to visit Canada in appreciation of his leadership during the UNEF deployment there. And after he visited Canada, Canada requested that he would be, after that he joined the Foreign Service. And after that, Canada requested that he be appointed Prime Minister Ambassador to Canada. He had so many friends during the deployment of UNEF that he had a very good contacts and positive feedback. So they wanted him to be ambassador to Canada. Nasser obliged, and he appointed the ambassador to Canada. Before he moved to Canada, however, Nasser contacted him and said that the Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, asked for a more proactive Egyptian ambassador. So Nasser contacted Hilmy and told him about the change. Number 26, please. This is the map for the deployment of the UNF troops. The red line is on the border between Egypt and the armistice agreement line with Israel, with Palestine at the time, which became Israel. This is the only international contact between Egypt on its eastern border with outside force, outside territory. Now the lines in blue is not Egypt on top. The Gaza Strip is blue because it's not. Gaza Strip was under Egyptian trusteeship after the war. Egypt did not annex the territory as Jordan annexed the West Bank. Now the blue line at the bottom there's no contact with any foreign territory. It's the Tehran, Sharm el-Sheikh access to the Gulf of Aqaba, and there were some United Nations forces. So when Egypt asked for the removal of the United Nations troops, it was from the international red line, not from the other two. But of course, it was take it or leave it. Either you remove them all or you keep them all. Israel refused to have it on its side of the borders, which complicated things. And when the troops were withdrawn, the war was inevitable, as Israel had plans all along to invade Egypt. As a matter of fact, the Israeli Prime Minister announced on November 7, 1956, the annexation of the entire Sinai and the Gaza Strip. You know, a few years after the end of World War II, when military aggression and conquering territories were a taboo, that was happened, and that was allowed to happen for a while until Israel was forced to withdraw. The major flaw of peacekeeping, the passive peacekeeping, is that it does not include provisions for conflict resolution mechanism. You can, as happened with UNEF, you stayed there for 11 years, keeping the peace. Nobody's fighting anybody, but then the conflict is still there, festering, and nobody is looking for a way out of this. Now, another point before I supposed to conclude is that the deployment of UNEF was under Chapter 6 of the Charter, which is non-enforcement measure. Now, Chapter 7 is an enforcement measure, so enforcement action. So it's not obligatory for Egypt to have accepted the UNEF troops because it was authorized by UN General Assembly, not the Security Council. Now, if it was under the Security Council as an enforcement action, then Egypt had the role of sovereignty in this situation would not have counted, because the Security Council assumes the right to move aside the issue of national sovereignty, national sovereignty, if that was the decision of the council. My God, I have a lot more, but I think maybe I should stop here. Okay, and that is the cartoon by somebody here in Victoria, the Times columnist, who's showing the UNEF in the middle of a world which is engaged in fights and conflict. And the rest is, who knows what's going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hanny. It's fascinating to realize how deeply entangled your personal history is with world history, and how taking us back to the early second part of the 20th century, in a way, sheds light on conflicts that are still with us. And I know that you're passionate about analyzing, trying to understand the Arab-Israel conflict, what's happening in the Middle East. And I think many of those issues that, in a way, took shape back then, are, in different modified ways, still plaguing our world today. But let me move to our discussants and respondents now. It's wonderful to have Greg and Martin joining us. Thank you very much for taking your time. Greg Blue, I don't think that both need much introduction here, but I do quickly run down, that Greg has been a CFGS Associate Fellow for the past couple of years after his retirement from the History Department in 2014. And to summarize his research interest, I think would take half an hour. So I just want to say that he has an encyclopedic knowledge of world history, with a particular focus on China and South Asia. But I think where his research intersects particularly with what Hanny told us is the history of colonial and post-colonial societies, the legacy of colonialism. And clearly, as a global historian, Greg has a keen interest in what's happening in the Middle East. Martin Bunton, our program committee chair and professor in history here at UVic, you all know him as our go-to person when it comes to the Middle East, a specialist in Middle Eastern history, world history, and colonial land policy. So extremely well positioned to speak to Hanny's research, and that both of them were on the supervisory committee of Hanny's PhD as well. So intimately familiar with Hanny's research and the contents of the book. So I think we agreed that Greg, you start us off, if I'm not mistaken, and then we'll move over to Martin. So Greg, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks, Oliver, and thank you, Hanny, for your presentation. When Hanny started talking about taking this project up as a interdisciplinary PhD project, something like 15 years ago, I think, he, as he said, was a little bit diffident about doing it because of his own engagement in the subject that he would be studying. But as we talked about, it became clear quite quickly that this had the potential to be a good original book, and I'm just delighted that that he's stuck with it and steered it to publication. What he offers us can be read in various ways. This is a substantial volume. It is now available as an electronic resource in the UVic library for people who want to follow up on it. One can look at it from various points of view. It's a contribution to scholarship in a field that has, regarding the Suez Crisis, regarding UNEF to a lesser extent, regarding Egyptian modern history. There's a lot of literature on all of these subjects, but this is an original contribution because of his particular perspective and the sources that he has access to. So as an original contribution to scholarship, it's also a participant observer's account. And as you will have seen from the pictures, he lived through the move towards independence for Egypt from the colonial order as a boy, and he became a young man over the course of the United Nations Emergency Force, the first one in place between 1956 and 1967. And he grew up in a family where his father was a principal actor in the events that, that were underway. And so to some extent, this is also a work of filial duty, telling the story of his father's role and of the circle that he lived in. And one of the powerful parts of this work is the fact that he does have his father's memoirs, substantial memoirs, to draw on, giving contemporary insights from the time about what was going on in the period of the Free Officers' Corps Revolution in 1952 and thereafter, at the time of the Suez Crisis itself in 1956, and then through the period of the UNEF, the United Nations Emergency Force, between 56 and 67. And then something I think he maybe didn't mention enough was he lived the consequences of all these developments in the diplomatic service of both the Egyptian government and then the Arab League. So over the following decade or so after 1967, Hanny can correct me on those dates. But this is a multifaceted work, and what does it consist of? Hanny's indicated several parts. Let me just sort of summarize those for those of you who haven't looked at the book. The core, coming to close to a third, is about the experience of the United Nations Emergency Force, especially its establishment and the first years between 1956 and 1959, and then its demise in 1966, 1967, and what the factors were that structured it in the beginning in terms of international relations and Egypt's place in the opposition to colonialism, and then the dynamics within international relations, but also within the Egyptian ruling elite that led to the withdrawal of the UNEF on Egypt's request in 1967, and then the 1967 Six-Day War, when Egypt was attacked by Israel, and the results of that war, of course, we still live with in terms of the occupation of the West Bank and the isolation of Gaza. So the core of the book, about approaching a third, has to do with the experience of the United Nations Emergency Force. Maybe something like a quarter of the book has to do with the background to the United Nations Emergency Force, including Egypt's role in the anti-colonial movement and the anti-colonial movement within Egypt in the first half of the 20th century, and the Nasserite Revolution in the early 1950s. And another part of the work has to do with the way different notions of sovereignty and the limits on sovereignty played out through the United Nations Emergency Force debates about what its role was, about what rights Egypt had or didn't have in dealing with it, and the consequences of those debates. And then there's another maybe 20% of the book that looks at the experience of peacekeeping since the 1990s, and considers, for example, the Brahimi report on peacekeeping in 2000, and contributions under Ban Ki-moon when he was Secretary General, and more recently under Antonio Guterres. So this is the final section of the book, which draws on the experience of the UNEF and looks at new developments in terms of what is different from UNEF and in terms of what the UNEF experience suggests in terms of the nature of peacekeeping. So Hanny has looked at or considered Egypt and anti-colonialism. Sorry, just turned off my screen, didn't I? I want, in the few minutes that I have remaining, to just consider briefly the importance of the Suez Crisis in particular, and the UNEF experience in particular, as parts of broader international trends. And we can say one of the great changes of the 20th century in world history was the demise of European colonialism. In 1900, the world statesmen and most educated public opinion thought that colonialism was inevitable, and most thought that it was a good thing. Most of the leading statesmen of the world's great powers at the time. By the end of the century, by the end of the 20th century, colonialism was seen as a relic of a bygone era, and in many quarters reviled, although not in all quarters reviled, but in many. The first half of the 20th century saw the emergence of major anti-colonial movements. After the Second World War, there was a flood of liberation movement globally, and success for the liberation movements in various waves. First wave from 1946 down until 1954 saw Britain and France lose their the major holdings that they had, the biggest holdings that they had in Asia. In 1947, at the beginning of the Cold War, there were 4 world great powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, but also the British Empire and the French Empire, was as it had been reconstituted after World War II and the occupations of World War II. By 1965, the British and the French empires were to a large extent dismantled. And both of those powers were clearly subordinate powers to the United States, no longer independent great powers in their own right. Between the first wave of independence after the Second World War in Asia, when India, Pakistan, most of the Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia, the Philippines, Burma got their independence, and the second wave starting in 1957, when most of the African countries got independence, or the majority, by 1965, certainly those in the British and French empires. Key turning point, all the literature on decolonization bears this out, key turning point came with the Suez Crisis. And the role played by that crisis in the broad span of decolonization is open to debate. I'm not going to go into that here. But it's clear that the Nasserite regime, Nasser in particular, played a major part in that process, in particular in associating Egypt with the broader Afro-Asian solidarity movement that had started under Indian initiative in the late 1940s, and that reached a kind of high point in 1955 in the Bandung Conference, which brought together a whole range of countries from Saudi Arabia and Japan to the People's Republic of China, together calling for decolonization. That movement was one that Nasser associated himself with at the Bandung Conference. He became, for the first time, a really international global leader. And following it, he gave increased aid, because he'd already been giving aid, to liberation movements across Africa. One of the important outcomes of his involvement was that in Ghana in 1958, Kwame Nkrumah held the so-called Accra Conference, the first African Peoples Conference to promote decolonization across the continent. And again, there's a lot of debate about how that movement impacted the rest of the decolonization process. But that it did have an impact is quite clear. And one way was that it gave encouragement to Patrice Lumumba in the then Belgian Congo to organize the first all Congolese political party across the entire country. That was something that alarmed the Western powers, the United States and Britain, as well as Belgium. Congo gained its independence in June of 1960. And between 1960 and 1965, there occurred what's known as the Congo Crisis. Lumumba was assassinated by his Congolese enemies and their Belgian masters. The Americans and the British also had money out on his head as well at the same time. And throughout this crisis, a new peacekeeping initiative was set up that in some ways built on the UNEF, but then ballooned and became the biggest UN peacekeeping force at the time, the United Nations force in Congo. And this earned such a bad reputation around the world for manipulating events in the Congo in the interest of the Western powers that peacekeeping in Africa in particular was discredited for the next quarter of a century. We didn't have another major peacekeeping force in Africa until Namibia was gaining its independence from South Africa in 1989. So the UNEF experience fed another kind of peacekeeping experience. The mission in the Congo discredited peacekeeping. UNEF had other kinds of lessons that could be drawn. And when in 1989 and in the 1990s, peacekeeping once again gained credit, there was looking back to the UNEF experience. Congo Crisis was by then something of a memory, although the beneficiary of it, Mobutu Sese Seko, remained in power down until 1996. So the discrediting of the Congo peacekeeping effort was being watched in Egypt very carefully. And the disasters there, I think, probably fed concerns about peacekeeping force on Egyptian soil among the Egyptian military as well. And Hanny picks up the story in the book of how then there was pressure on Nasser to get the United Nations Emergency Force between Egypt and Israel on the Egyptian side of the border only to withdraw, bringing in notions of sovereignty and sovereign equality and parity. So I'm going to stop there because I think I've reached my time, but Hanny, thank you once again for this book and congratulations on it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Martin.
Okay, Hanny, congratulations, Mabruk, and thank you so much for this. Greg and Oliver, thank you to you as well. Can I quickly also thank Michael Carpenter, the director at this point of the Middle East Discussion Group, and for his support in getting this going. And of course, Stephanie for all of her behind the scenes work as well. So I want to make three brief sort of points. I'll say a few words a little about Egypt and the subject itself. And then I want to pick up on the relationship between the scholar and the subject. And this is something that Tariq Ismail, who is Hanny's external examiner, and he together with Greg have both written very, very nice forwards to the book. And he and Tariq make some interesting points about this relationship. And then finally, I'm going to try to shed some light on, or see if we can't shed some light on current politics in Egypt. A little bit unfair to Hanny to take us into there, but there's some, I think, some interesting points to pick up on in Hanny's discussion around sovereignty, and also some of the anecdotes shared that are in the memoir that Hanny shares. So first, both Oliver and Greg have already made this point, but the centrality of Egypt to world history, it's hard to underestimate, really, isn't it? When you think about theories of imperialism and how many theories, how much of the historiography looks at the 1881-82 invasion of Alexandria, or you look at theories of the colonial state and the significance of Lord Cromer's rule in Egypt, or decolonization and the Suez Crisis, or I'd also add neoliberalism in the 1970s. Egypt's like an experiment for the Mount Pelerin Society. This is a decade before the Thatchers and the Reagans. And of course, here we have the United Nations Emergency Force, the very first UN force. So again, Egypt, kind of the central role. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I think world history would prove that you're much better off being ignored generally than being at the center of these things. And I have no doubt that the Middle East would be a very different and in comparison today, much nicer place to live if it had been ignored by world events over the last 2 centuries. But a second point to make here is Hanny's role in telling this story, and in particular, his access to this memoir, which is such a valuable source. It's hard to, I think, overestimate how difficult it can be for Egyptians to write Egyptian history. I mean, We had a couple of years ago, we had a visit by Khalid Fahmy, who at the time, currently a professor at Cambridge, but at the time was the chair of American University Cairo's history department. And he talked at length about how difficult it is for Egyptians to access their own archives, certainly in comparison to the ease with which they can access their own history in the London archives. But he said some very powerful things about how usually for security reasons, it's so difficult for to access Egypt's own history, particularly in the 20th century. It's more straightforward if you're doing work on Muhammad Ali in the 1800s. So here we have access to such an extremely valuable source. Now there's so much to say, and Greg has alluded to this as well, about the relationship here between Hanny and his subject. But in drawing attention to the significance of this memoir, I thought and if Stephanie could draw up this one image, there's one anecdote here. This is on page 13, and it's such a rich one, and I think telling one that I thought I'd share it with you quickly. The scene here is 1954, so this is 2 years after the revolution, but it's a moment that Hanny refers to, or as is referred to as the March or October 1954 crisis, where the future political direction of the revolution, well, the 52 coup turned into a revolution, was going to take. And you have this incredible cast of characters all in one room. You have a very exhausted Nasser lying on a bunk bed. You have his commander-in-chief, newly promoted Amr, who was hugely responsible for the debacle in 1967. And then you have Hanny's father. So if I could just draw your attention here to the sentence that begins, Hilmy met Nasser at Army headquarters where Nasser was resting. Members of the RCC were engaged in heated discussions over the proper response to the officers. And these were officers who were debating the future role, political role that the army should take here 2 years after the coup. The Minister of War, General Amr, was promoted from the rank of major, interesting, just promoted, was extremely agitated. He regarded the action of the protesting officers as unacceptable disrespect and insubordination, angrily removed, I mean, the theatrics of all of this, angrily removed his officers' shoulder rank insignia and threw them onto the floor in protest. I mean, it's such an obsequious, I think, almost sycophantic position on his part, which I think stands in sharp contrast to Hanny's father, as we'll see, okay. Nasser complained that the officer's action was threatening the stability of the whole regime, and jokingly he said, I mean, why don't you go and frighten the officers with your big mustache? Okay, at some point we have to raise that mustache, didn't we? Such a magnificent mustache. But the larger point to raise here, I think, is Egyptians joke, right? I mean, there's the role of humor in Egyptian society and politics is so key here. So it's interesting that it's hard to get an anecdote, I think, without there being a joke involved somewhere. And certainly Hanny's smile and laughter has been a big part of his role at the center over the years. After the laughter subsided, Hilmy responded, as befitting friends and former colleagues. So in contrast to the obsequious of Amr, we have Hanny's father here as a friend, right, raising a really difficult issue, and that is, Gamal, the army should relinquish power to a new elected civilian administration, not tainted by the old politicians. The soldiers should go back to the barracks, as the objective of overthrowing the old corrupt regime had been accomplished. So this is 1954. So just to take some concluding comments here to think about the present, right? Nasser replies here, to finish the paragraph, that the revolution, quote unquote, needed time, so we've gone from coup to revolution, which is interesting, needed time to implement the program at the heart of the army action first. Now this program was, as Hanny details significantly, very much about achieving the political independence of Egypt. But for Nasser, it's also about a very dramatic program, as Hanny also pointed out, of economic and social development. Land reform was key to all of that. And I agree that there's no doubting, Nasser's devotion to this, but he sets up a really interesting question here about where sovereignty lies in terms of the people of Egypt, right? It's one thing to protect the sovereignty of Egypt against imperialism, but where's the role of the people in all of this? Because essentially what Nasser does here, by not going back to the barracks, and I'm really intrigued by this possibility in 1954 that it might have happened, he sets up with the Egyptian people kind of a relationship that says, we provide for you independence, political independence in the world, social and economic development, and in return, you support us. And it's that basic deal that that Nasser signed, that Sadat, his successor, picks up on, Mubarak, his successor, picks up on. And it wasn't really until 2011 that the people of Egypt, when they come out onto Tahrir Square, and as it were, claim popular sovereignty for themselves there, are holding Nasser accountable, I think, in the way that Amr tried to do in 1954. I'm going to end with one quick joke just about, you know, the kind of the political trajectory that Nasser's setting, the relationship between the regime and the people up here, in contrast to the independence he's achieving in the world, in the global context. There's a joke about Mubarak, and so this is a third in the 2000s. There's lots of jokes about Mubarak, right? And this is in the 2000s. So this is sort of the 5th or 6th decade of essentially Nasser's regime, and he's on his deathbed. He's not well. A lot of jokes about Nasser have him on his deathbed, and they involve an angel coming down, an angel of death coming down and saying, "Okay, Nasser, or sorry, okay, Mubarak, it's time to say goodbye to the Egyptian people." And Mubarak responds and says, "No, why? Where are they going?" So, and what's interesting is the extent to which, I guess I'm trying to argue, you know, that Nasser was responsible for that, for that relationship with the people, which raises interesting questions of independence and sovereignty, doesn't it? And something that his father had picked up on as early as 1954. Thank you, Hanny. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Oliver.
Thanks, Greg and Martin. Yeah, Martin, I'm wondering whether you committed to writing a book, The Blessing of Being Forgotten by World History. Now that sounds like a great idea, but yeah, more seriously, Hanny, I'm looking at the watch. Maybe what we could do now is collect some thoughts, some questions, and then come back to you in the last round of reflection. Because if you now respond to Martin and Greg, it might take up a lot of too much time. So is anyone who would like to come in and either question or comment, or Miriam, you know, please go ahead. Good to see you back.
Thank you so much. This was just wonderful. Thank you so much, Hanny, and of course also Greg and Martin for commenting on Hanny's finished book. I had some time to look into it today and yesterday, and Hanny, this is wonderful. I'll order it for our library as soon as possible. Thank you so much. Well, you all know that I also had that a similar but very different journey with like being occupied with the struggle of the Arab world, trying to somehow get rid of those echoes of colonial past, and worked on on South Yemen. So a very different example, and where they were first the British and then in colonizers in disguise, Soviets and East Germans. But my question won't be on that topic, and maybe not even on the book itself, Hanny, but on the project. Because I was wondering, when I finished my book, I was so relieved, and I did not have that intensity and that history breathing down my neck, what I was feeling reading it, and I was not part of the story. And so I was wondering, how would you summarize the feeling when you finished it? Because you said this book should have been written so long before, and thank you so much for sharing your very, very personal experiences with your father and this part of your life. We have exchanged on that, but I didn't even know the extent to what that actually did to your life and to your perspective on life. And I don't know if you're willing to answer a question like that, which is very personal as a first question, but that's what I was thinking the whole time. So
maybe it's a good time to go back to Hanny. That shouldn't wait. If you'd like to answer this or respond to this, Hanny, any reflection on your personal engagement and involvement?
Well, it was I don't know how to describe it, except that I was born into it. I had no choice. I found myself on the receiving end of bullets, flying when I was a child, and then my father was forever engaged in a secret operation to dislodge the British And then after that, the war started, and we were forced to leave our house, which was located in the barracks, the largest barracks in the Suez Canal region, because it was military target. So we had to leave, and we were driving to Cairo at 3 o'clock in the morning, while trucks carrying troops moving towards the canal in order to confront the Israelis. We didn't know at the time that the British were about to attack. And then once we arrived in Cairo, and you know, the bombs started to land and all that, so we had to move again, because my grandparents, where I stayed with, were next to a military air base, Al-Mazar. So it was a prime target. So it was, and then after that, we went to Gaza, and I lived there in Gaza for several years. And you know, you see all these military people from the UNEF who were constantly in and out of our house, because my father was the chief liaison officer there. So I was exposed directly to these people. And my father was asking his Swedish adjutant to help me learn English. So anyway, so I was always willing to listen and talk, and he was willing to help develop that, obviously not successfully, but after that, I found myself in government, and dealing with the aftermath of horrible situation in the '67 war, where thousands were killed by bombardment of civilian targets, cities and infrastructure. And I saw, as I said, I don't know if you recall, I saw many people running in the street, not knowing where to go, what happened to their children. I saw a woman carrying a child and screaming, "Where's my husband? Where's my husband?" So the intensity of my experience is there, and that's why I was very hesitant to start writing on a book on that subject. So now I'm finished. I feel relieved to answer.
Yep. Thank you, Hanny.
Okay.
Who would like to else to come into the discussion? You can start your camera or let me know in the chat.
Thank you very much. My name is Abdel Hadi, and I'm from Gaza, actually.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Could you speak up a little bit?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
That's all right. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Hanny. And I'm not sure if your father is Hilmy al-Halabi or not, or Hilmy Abdel Baqi. I don't know if he is the person we are talking about, your father or not. Actually, my father was with the Egyptian administration for some time, with the Egyptian army in Gaza too. And my question here, I haven't read the book, unfortunately. I had no time, and not the book itself. That's the problem, as I'm in lockdown. And my question here, how do you frame the question of Palestine at that time in relation to the Egyptian Revolutionary Council, but also to the Egyptian peace, let's say, process? It's a process, always a process. That's my question.
Okay.
Thank you, Hadi.
Now?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. شكرا يا سيدي. أنا كنت في غزة 4 سنين ورحت مدرسة فلسطين الثانوية وتخرجت من هناك. Okay, I was just telling him my history in Gaza. The position of the Egyptian new revolutionary government towards Palestine was, of course, supportive. Where we wanted all to have free Palestine and all that, but it was too late, because the Security and the General Assembly resolution came into being, and Israel not only took over the territory allotted to her, but took over a big chunk of the territory allotted to the Palestinians. And the Palestinians were forced to leave, and they were expelled, and many were butchered and killed. And on the other hand, the Egyptian army and the Arab armies combined were no match to the Israeli force, which was very well armed, very well trained, and very well motivated. They were there and they were fighting for their lives. The Egyptian army, for instance, were basically conscript of peasants from the Delta, had nothing to do with the Sinai or Palestine. But there was, at the intellectual level, at the popular level, there was great support for the Palestinian cause. And as you know, Egypt did not annex the Gaza Strip. It was doing what's known as a trusteeship. But the West Bank was annexed by Jordan. And so there was also something called Al-Kayan al-Falastini, which is a Palestinian entity, which was supposed to create a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza. But at that time, Egypt and many Arab states said, no, we are opposed to that, because that means that we accept the existence of Israel on territory which was supposed to be Palestinian territory. So we are going to accept the status quo. That is not acceptable. So in hindsight, we should have accepted it, because now they have nothing. So yeah, there is a great support for Palestine and the Palestinian cause in Egypt. Although at certain periods, there was a clash between the Palestinians, goals and Egyptian goals, because Egypt was more concerned with its own problems, its own, confrontation with Israel itself, than to worry about the Palestinians. And then what happened in Hamas, when Hamas took over Gaza, that was a non-starter for Egypt to cooperate with the Gaza Strip, because it was a Muslim Brother-based entity, and actually it started to help the terrorists attacking people and attacking Egyptian military units in the Sinai. I don't know if you are part of the Hamas or your father was part of Hamas, but just to correct the name, my father was Amin Hilmy, not Khalid. Amin Hilmy, that's all. And I know the people who work there. I lived with many people. I talked to many Palestinian refugees who were colleagues in school and friends, and I visited many of the Palestinian refugee camps. And I always was struck by the fact that many of the Palestinian refugees were totally adamant. They do not want to be settled in the surrounding Arab states. They all wanted to go back to their homes. And this was any attempt or any talk about, compensating them or settling them somewhere was considered as a treason. So yes, Palestinian is, or Palestine is a very important cause in our, in Egypt's, conscience.
Thank you. Just a follow-up question about this. No, my father is not about Hamas. I mean, Hamas is in 87, so that we're talking about 50s and 60s. It's a long time before, yeah.
Okay.
The question here, no, because in the literature of history with regard to Palestine, Egypt, there is this time when the Egyptian administration or the Egyptian regime has hostility towards the PLO. That's why I'm asking this question. So the PLO was rejected by the Egyptian regime as much as it was rejected by King Hussein.
Okay, well, as you know, Yasser Arafat and his Fatah group was established with the help of the Nasser government. I don't know if you are aware of that, but yes, they were very supportive of their activities in the beginning. But to make a long story short, I think, in my opinion, Egypt betrayed the Palestinian cause by signing this peace treaty with Israel without making sure that the Palestinian rights, cause, concerns, and grievances are addressed. This is a one-sided agreement which was on the wreckage of Palestinian entity and Palestinian hopes for independence.
Thank you. Okay. Anyone else who would like to join us this morning? getting close to the end, but we definitely have time for one or two more. Anyone from around the virtual table, you could probably feel that we would love to sit down with Hanny and hear more stories. It's full of this kind of insight. Yeah, Ken, for just 1 second. And we definitely would need normally a glass to toast his achievement, but all these things might have to wait at the moment. Ken.
Well, thanks very much, and congratulations on a wonderful piece of work. Very quick question, because you mentioned your father was the liaison with the UNEF forces with the Canadian General Burns, that he was invited to Canada. They wanted him to be ambassador. Obviously, there was a strong connection there. What's your sense in terms of how his interaction and the interaction of other Egyptians during the time of UNEF may have influenced Canadian views towards decolonization? And what was the interplay there?
Excellent question, because in the beginning, Canada, who was credited with the creation of UNEF, in the beginning wanted to have Gaza Strip under UN trusteeship, which Egypt, of course, rejected, because that was against the return to the status quo ante before the Israel attack. And also he wanted, and that's Pearson, at the time the foreign minister, the Secretary of State for Canada, suggested that the UN, the invading forces from Britain and France assume the job of UNEF and wearing UNEF uniform and performing that function and of course Egypt said, are you asking us to accept an invading force to work as a United Nations troop? So that was not, so there was a very, not very welcoming approach towards Canada. And then Nasser refused to accept the participation of Canada in the United Nations force. And then Pearson sent him a letter, and my father saw that letter. So Nasser told him, and told General Burns as well, that how do you expect us to accept Her Majesty's troop to come in and help us get rid of Her Majesty's troop, because Canada and Britain were under the same. So that was, and then finally, with a lot of pressure from abroad, Nasser accepted the participation of Canada into the United Nations forces, provided that they are not combat units, they're just administrative and things like that. And then towards the end, when Egypt wanted the UNEF forces withdrawn, Canada refused that and said, no, they should stay. So Egypt was mad and said, hey, Canadian troops first to go. And they insisted that the Canadian troops would leave. So that was a very sad part, because I remember the Canadian troops were there and they were helping. General Burns and my father was good friends. As a matter of fact, when General Burns passed away, my father flew to Ottawa specifically to attend his funeral. So General Burns, when I arrived in Canada, he invited me and invited my wife, and he showed us and drove us around the town and invited us to his house very kindly. So there were goodwill towards Canada, but also there was some suspicion that Canada is carrying the direction of either the United States or Britain. And actually, within the Canadian establishment, Saint Laurent, the Prime Minister at the time, was supposed to be, or was very against the British action and Israeli action in Egypt, while Pearson was very he said he was trying to give them cover to save face, so they can withdraw from Egypt without too much humiliation. So there was a tension in the ruling circles between the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State.
Thank you, Annie. I think Greg would like to come in, and add to this. We should come to a close soon, but Greg, please, and Martin maybe as well. You're muted, Greg.
Okay, am I all right now? Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to throw in, because I don't know that we've mentioned it so far, that this is a Canadian story, in that it was Lester Pearson who came up with the idea of UNEF originally.
Yes.
made the proposal in 1956. And Hanny's book includes various sections on the Canadian role that build on the 2009 book by Michael Carroll that was published by UBC Press called Pearson's Peacekeepers.
Yeah.
That pulls the story together, but Hanny can add things to the story that Carroll told. But the story, one interesting twist for those who know Canadian diplomatic history is that an important role was played by E.H. Norman, Herbert Norman, who was the Canadian ambassador in 1956, 1957, who was being pursued by the CIA for his political views.
Yes.
Thanks. Martin?
Thanks, Oliver. Two quick comments. One is that for Canadians, when we think of our peacekeeping history, it's something we're quite proud of, et cetera, right? But to see it from the point of view of Egypt is an extremely important sort of balance to all of that, you know, what it's like for the country to be occupied, as it were, by the UN force. And if I recall correctly, that there is another interesting angle here for Canadian history, and that is that quite literally the first forces that were suggested did carry the insignia. I mean, I think that Nasser kind of balked at the idea of a peacekeeping force carrying the name of a royal family and the flag of the royal insignia. And so I think as a result of that, that's in part where some of the discussions came for Canada, is having a new flag.
Mm-hmm.
How important Egypt is.
Any last reflection?
Yes, yes. The first division or first group of troops from Canada assigned to or proposed for the UNEF service were called the Princess Patricia's Own Rifle, or something like, you know. So, yeah, as you say, Martin, it's a royal family. So that even General Burns himself, he said, within the Canadian Army, we have 7 divisions, and 6 divisions, and you choose one of them which with that royal name. So he promised Nasser. He said, no, this will not be chosen for the troops.
Hanny, thank you so much. Big congratulations again. It might not feel, you know, that you've just published it, but I think you still hopefully appreciate, you know, what you've achieved, and I hope this book will find, you know, the readership and the response that it deserves. Greg, Martin, thank you very much for joining us today, and all of you, you know, for being with us this morning. I really very much hope that we will have a chance to sit down with Hanny again soon and, you know, share some of the stories that, you know, the book is full of, you know, given his background. And so, Stephanie, you can stop the